A bitter wind rolled down the valley, like the growl of something unseen, carrying with it the scream of a lone cry that cut through the canyon walls. For a heartbeat it was impossible to tell if it came from a bird of prey circling above or the throat of some lost soul whose echo refused to die. The sound lingered, cold as steel, and the men on horseback shifted uneasily in their saddles. Even the horses, thick with lather despite the cold, tossed their heads as though the valley itself warned them back. 6 riders pushed onward. Their shapes were hunched against the cutting wind, their coats dark with frost, and their faces harder than the ground they crossed. Each was different, stitched together like a patchwork quilt of malice. The biggest among them rode loose and laughing, his voice loud enough to drown the storm. His laughter carried no joy, only a cruel rhythm meant to break the silence. Beside him, lean and narrow-eyed, rode a man who spoke seldom, preferring the language of his knives, 3 balanced perfectly across his chest, handles worn to the shape of his hands. Behind them, slumped in his saddle, was a drunk whose eyes swam with whiskey even as his flask clinked against his belt. He had not drawn a sober breath in years, yet somehow never fell from his horse. Near the rear rode a man with scars that chewed across his cheek and forehead, lines left by wars long past. His gaze never lifted from the snow-darkened trail, and in his silence was something broken but dangerous, a memory of killing that had never faded. Leading them were 2 brothers, almost identical save for the narrow scar across one's chin. Their voices carried in low whispers, weaving plans and promises, twin predators always circling the same thought, control. They were not the sort to fear weather, nor the ghost of a scream echoing off canyon walls. Yet even they lowered their tones when the valley pressed close, when the trees leaned heavy with snow, and the air itself seemed to listen. Their talk turned to a man they had never seen, a solitary figure hidden deep in the high country. The laughing brute snorted. "A trapper, they say. Lives on meat and silence. Don't sound like much." The knife thrower flicked his eyes at the brute, but said nothing. His hand brushed one of his blades, a silent correction. One brother leaned close to the other, voice like gravel. "Not just a trapper. They say he's lasted winters that break men in half. Wolves won't track him, and hunters don't follow his trails. He's more shadow than man." The drunk gave a broken chuckle. "Then why bother? Plenty of cabins ripe for takin down south." The scarred soldier finally spoke, his voice low, carrying a rasp that froze the others in place. "Because shadows hold gold. Furs, pelts, trade routes. A man alone up here. He's hiding more than meat." The brute grinned, showing teeth yellowed by tobacco. "Or maybe he's hiding from us. That makes it fun." Still, though they laughed and argued, not one of them looked long into the timber where the pines stood thick, their branches bent with the weight of fresh snow. It was a forest that did not welcome, a wall of silence punctured only by the occasional crack of ice shifting in the river below. The land here carried the bones of things men had forgotten, abandoned mines swallowed by drifts, shafts that breathed cold air like the mouth of the earth itself, and rivers frozen so black they seemed carved from obsidian. "Tell me, would you ride into a wilderness where even wolves wouldn't follow you?" The brothers urged their men forward, their spurs clinking faint against the hush of snow. Above them, clouds thickened like bruises, and the last threads of sunlight bled across the peaks, staining them a deep, violent red. The valley stretched long, a throat that swallowed the reckless. Few who entered these high passes returned with their wits, fewer still with their lives. But outlaws seldom measured risk the way honest men did. The brute broke the silence again, his voice ragged. "I don't care if this trapper's a ghost. If he's got a roof and a fire, that's ours come nightfall." He spat into the snow, where it froze before it landed. The knife thrower's smile was thin as a blade's edge. "You'll laugh when he cuts your tongue out." That drew another ripple of unease. Each man knew the stories. They were told by miners huddled around campfires, by travelers who swore they'd seen a figure vanish into the tree-line only to hear the snap of steel in the dark. They spoke of a man who could walk in storms without leaving prints, a figure whose traps hung like judgment across forgotten trails. The scarred soldier muttered something under his breath, words none of the others caught. It might have been a prayer or a warning. Snow deepened beneath the horses' hooves, crunching like bones with every step. The river beside them cracked and groaned, jagged seams running through its frozen skin. Old mine shafts yawned black in the hillside, timbers rotted and leaning, as if the earth was littered with mouths ready to swallow man whole. The drunk lifted his flask and took another swallow, his voice slurred. "Ain't nothing but stories. Ghosts don't bleed, and if he breathes, he bleeds." But even he did not sound convinced. As night crept down from the peaks, the valley grew tighter, the trail winding through thick stands of pine, where branches clawed at riders' faces and snow dropped heavy from above. The wind shifted, carrying with it not just cold, but the sharp tang of smoke, with smoke, faint but certain. Every man stiffened. Eyes darted. Hands rested on rifles and pistols. The brothers exchanged a glance. One grinned, the scar on his chin tugging like a hook. "He's close." The brute laughed again, but softer now, as though afraid the trees might hear. Somewhere in the distance, an owl cried once, then went silent. The horses stamped and rolled their eyes. For all their bravado, the 6 men could not ignore the feeling that the wilderness itself had turned against them, watching with patient eyes from the shadows. The scarred soldier's hand never left his rifle. The knife-thrower's fingers tapped the hilts across his chest. The drunk swayed, but his gaze sharpened, and the brothers, still whispering, led them deeper into the dark, chasing smoke and legend. The valley closed around them like a fist. Snow drifted down in thick curtains, erasing their trail, muffling every sound but the creak of leather and the churn of hooves. They did not know whether the scream they had heard belonged to a hawk, a man, or something else altogether. The cabin stood alone where the timberline thinned, its roof hunched against the weight of snow, and its chimney breathing thin smoke into the pale afternoon sky. Pelts stretched taut along wooden frames hardened in the cold, their fur stiff with frost. Steel traps leaned against the wall, each one polished to a merciless shine. A rifle rested above the hearth inside, its barrel cleaned until it caught firelight like water. Everything about the place bore the mark of a hand that wasted nothing, a man who sharpened his life down to the edge of survival. He moved inside the cabin with quiet precision, tall, shoulders carved by years of carrying what could not be laid down, his hair touched with gray but not soft, and his eyes set deep beneath a brow that cast them in permanent shadow. His face told nothing easily. There were lines there, yes, but they spoke of silence, of winters endured and storms survived, not of weakness. He was neither young nor old. He belonged to no easy measure of time. The locals had a name for him, though few had ever spoken to him long enough to hear his true one. They called him Crow Shadow. The reason was simple. He disappeared into timber the way crows vanished against a storm sky. One moment present, the next swallowed whole by the woods. Inside his cabin, the stillness was broken only by the hiss of wood on the fire. He laid tools across the table in ordered rows, knives honed, needles for stitching hides, bullets set in neat lines. Every action was deliberate, every gesture carrying the kind of discipline born not from choice but necessity. A man alone in such country could not afford hesitation. Above the mantel hung a locket, tarnished at the edges, but polished often enough to reveal the face of a woman and child within. The silver had bent slightly where once it had been gripped too hard, clutched during nights when whiskey and grief did battle in his chest. He rarely looked at it directly, but he never moved it either. It stayed there, an anchor and a wound. There had been a time, years past, when fire lit more than his hearth. A border raid, quick and merciless, had torn through the settlement where his family lived. By the time he returned, only ashes remained, and in them no survivors. Men told him to bury the grief with the bodies, but grief is not so easily given to the earth. It follows, clinging to the edges of silence. From that night onward, Crow Shadow built walls not just of logs and stone, but of distance. He spoke little, trusted less, and vanished into wilderness as though the world itself no longer deserved his voice. If you lost everyone you loved, would you still open your door to a stranger? The mountains outside had no answer. They stood cold and eternal, jagged peaks stabbing at a sky bruised with gathering storm. Crow Shadow stepped outside, boots crunching into hard snow. The forest was different that morning. He knew it before he knew why. It was in the hush of it. The birds had gone quiet, not just here but for miles. Rabbits that should have darted across open patches stayed hidden, and even the river moved slower, its groans muffled beneath heavy ice. He knelt, pressing a hand to the snow. Tracks, faint but recent, crossed the edge of his valley. 6 horses, ridden hard. Their hooves struck deep where the riders carried weight, and the direction was unmistakable. They had come down from the pass, and were curving in, toward his valley. He rose without sound, pulling his coat tighter, and walked to the cabin door. His hand brushed the frame, feeling its worn wood. He had always known peace here was borrowed time. Nothing stayed untouched forever. Inside, he moved with calm purpose. Rifles checked, traps inspected, powder dry. He stoked the fire, just enough to keep coals alive, but not enough to send smoke billowing into the sky. His every action spoke of a man who lived by signs and shadows, who understood the way wilderness carried messages if one only listened. The wolves would not come near. That alone told him the riders who approached were not travelers, not harmless hunters seeking trade. Wolves knew men, and these horses had carried the wrong kind. Crow's shadow sat for a long moment at the table, hands folded, eyes on the locket above the mantel. A memory flickered there, brief and sharp. A child's laugh, a hand tugging at his coat, the scent of bread fresh from a fire long gone. He let the memory pass, as he always did, locking it away behind the silence of his face. The wind outside shifted. He heard the faint creak of trees swaying under snow, and with it, the low roll of distant hooves. He stood, tall and steady, and pulled his rifle from the wall. In that moment, he did not curse the riders for coming. He did not welcome them either. He only prepared, the way men prepare when they know what the world asks of them, when the wilderness demands a reckoning. The valley breathed differently now, as if holding itself still. The birds had gone silent. The trees leaned heavier, and the river carried no sound. Somewhere beyond the timberline, 6 men pushed into his world, laughing at stories they half believed. Crow's shadow knew better, and in the deep silence of the snow-laden forest, he waited. Smoke carried farther than men. It drifted up from the flats where the stage line's way station once stood, curling against the winter sky in a dark smear that told of fire and death. By the time ranch hands from the low valley reached it, the building was only a blackened ribcage of timbers, and the snow was red in 2 places where men had fallen. Horses were gone, provisions stolen. The ones who found it said the fire burned hot enough to melt iron hinges, and in the ruin they found tracks leading north, deeper toward the timber country. 6 riders, heavy horses. Word spread faster than wind. In the saloon, voices dropped to whispers, not out of respect for the dead, but fear of where those riders were headed. Men who had never cared for the solitary trapper still felt unease at the thought of him being hunted. If they find him, one muttered into his glass, he won't stand a chance. Nobody stands a chance against wolves like that. The sheriff, weary-eyed and carrying too many years on his shoulders, shook his head when asked if he'd ride out. I'd be leading men into a coffin, he said. Best leave shadows to settle their own reckonings. In the high country, Crow's shadow had no knowledge of the charge station or the whispers of townsfolk. His world was the hiss of the river under ice, the snap of branches in the cold, the quiet that told him where life still lingered. That morning he heard something else, the frantic bark of a dog, followed by the cry of a child. He moved without thought, feet biting into snow as he followed the sound to a bend in the river. There, a boy clung to a slab of ice, his arms stiff with cold, his face pale beneath the wool cap, slipping from his head. The dog whined and scratched at the bank, helpless. The river skin had cracked beneath the boy, and the current pulled at him, promising a death colder than bullets. Crow's shadow slid flat on his belly, hands reaching until his fingers caught rough wool. With one brutal heave, he dragged the child onto the snow and rolled him clear. The boy coughed water, body shaking, but he breathed. The trapper stripped off his coat and wrapped it around the boy, carried him back to the cabin, and set him by the fire. He spoke little, only enough to reassure. The child's eyes followed him with a mixture of awe and fear, as though even in rescue he seemed a figure carved more from stone than flesh. By dawn the boy was strong enough to walk, and Crow's shadow sent him home with his dog trailing at his heels. The only sign left behind was a small wooden toy soldier the boy had dropped, lying forgotten near the hearth. Crow's shadow set it on the mantel beside the locket, saying nothing. But shadows of another kind moved closer. The outlaws, swollen with confidence from the fire they had left behind, rode into the valley laughing. They knew the stories. They mocked them. A ghost in the timber. The brute sneered. A man who eats bark and howls with wolves. If he's real, we'll roast him like a rabbit. Their cruelty was not quick. It lingered, like frostbite. One of the brothers, grinning wide, produced a wolf skull he'd carried since the pass. With his knife he carved crude marks across the bone and hung it from a branch along the trail. "Let the shadow know," he said. "The hunters have come." Crow's shadow found it before nightfall. The skull grinned at him from the tree, hollow eyes staring. He stood for a long while, the silence of the forest pressing close. Then he reached up, took it down, and crushed it beneath his boot until the brittle fragments vanished into the snow. He turned back toward his cabin, his face unreadable. That night, while the wind moaned through the pines, he set his steel traps one by one, hands sure and steady. He walked trails no man but him could follow, checked caches buried years before, hidden rifles wrapped in oilcloth, dry powder sealed in jars, knives untouched by rust. He moved like a man who had been waiting, not for days or weeks, but for the inevitable return of violence into his life. Each gesture was deliberate, not born of panic, but the rhythm of someone who had faced worse storms and survived. Inside his cabin, he sat at the table sharpening blades until they sang under the stone. His eyes never lifted to the fire. They stayed on steel, as though in its reflection he might find the future. The locket on the mantel glimmered faintly, catching firelight, but he did not look at it tonight. Tonight belonged to silence and preparation. Would you stand and fight, or vanish into the mountains forever? The choice hung heavy in the rafters. To some, the mountains offered safety, a labyrinth of stone and pine where a man could hide until the world forgot him. But Crow's shadow was not made of hiding. The valley was his. The rivers, the traps, the silence, they belonged to him as much as to the earth itself. To abandon it was to abandon the last thing he still claimed as his own. Outside, the forest shifted. Snow fell in soft veils, muting sound, but not enough to hide the presence of riders threading deeper into his world. He heard them not with ears, but with instinct. The hush of animals gone to ground, the unnatural creak of branches disturbed by careless men. He felt the weight of their laughter pressing against the stillness. He banked the fire low until only coals glowed, drew his rifle across his knees, and sat in the dim red light. His breathing was even, his eyes sharp. For years he had lived as though every day might be the one when shadows of the past returned. Now they had. The wolf skull lay shattered under snow. The trail had been marked. The valley waited, and Crow's shadow, silent and steady, prepared for the storm that would soon break against his solitude. The moon climbed over the ridge, pale and thin, painting the snow with silver. The cabin sat quiet in its hollow, a single shape of dark logs against the drifted white. Smoke still trailed faint from the chimney, faint enough to lure men closer. The outlaws came like shadows with teeth, their horses stamping steam into the cold. 6 riders, hungry for ruin. The brothers led. Grins stretched wide in the glow of lanterns they dared not shield. Behind them the brute tugged his rifle free, laughing under his breath as though the night were nothing more than a game. The knife-thrower moved silent, eyes quick and narrow. The drunk slumped, but even he gripped a torch with steady hand. The scarred soldier said nothing, his face hidden behind the ruin of war that made his silence heavier than words. They found no man waiting. The cabin door stood shut, locked from within, but no sound stirred. The brute was first to kick it in, his boot splintering the wood. Inside, the place was too clean, too deliberate. Rifles hung oiled, knives gleamed, pelts stretched across beams. Every tool lined in place, every measure exact. It was the home of a man who lived by order in a world of chaos. The drunk stumbled, tripped over a trunk half buried beneath furs. He pried it open with the heel of his boot and let out a low whistle. Inside lay metals tarnished but unmistakable, iron stars and brass tokens of the frontier wars, proof of service carved by blood and steel. Beneath them, a leather-bound journal scrawled with coded maps, strange marks winding through valleys and timber, lines too precise to be anything but war plans. The brothers stared, the smile fading from one's mouth. He ain't just a trapper. The scarred soldier reached down, lifted a medal between his thick fingers. Recognition lit in his ruined face. "I knew the name once," he muttered, voice like gravel scraped dry. "Crow's Shadow. Scout for the frontier columns. They said he moved like smoke and left nothing breathing behind." The brute only laughed harder, tossing a torch into the shed. Flames roared quick, licking along dry timber, devouring the roof in moments. Another torch hurled through the cabin window, shattering glass, filling the room with fire scream. Supplies cracked and spat in the heat, oil flaring, pelts blackening. The outlaws circled, their laughter sharp against the hiss of burning wood. To them, ruin was victory, proof they had stripped a ghost of his shelter. But not all ghosts burn with their homes. Unseen on the ridge above, Crow's Shadow stood, the firelight painting his face in flickering orange. His eyes did not widen. His jaw did not clench. He only watched as the flames climbed high, devouring years of solitude. When at last he spoke, it was barely a whisper, a single name carried away on the wind. No one heard it but him. He did not curse the outlaws. He did not rush forward. He simply turned, fading back into timber as though the fire itself had birthed him. The gang grew bold around the blaze, throwing pelts into the snow, stomping across the man's few possessions. The brute swigged whiskey and poured the rest onto the flames, laughing when the fire surged brighter. They thought themselves kings of a ruin, lords of ash. Yet every step they took pressed deeper into a valley already claimed. Every movement stirred snares hidden for years, traps waiting like patient beasts. It began with silence. The knife thrower, walking toward the tree-line, vanished without a cry. One moment there, the next swallowed whole. The ground had been hollow, a pit disguised with branches and snow. His lantern fell, shattering, spilling firelight into the dark maw. The others turned, confusion breaking into shouts. The brute roared with laughter again. Serves him right for wandering. Yet even as he laughed, the scarred soldier lifted his head, eyes scanning the dark. He had fought wars. He knew the feel of a battlefield tightening. Hours dragged into uneasy sleep. They tethered horses close, huddled near the ruin of the cabin, firelight clawing at their faces. Snow fell in slow veils, muting every sound but the hiss of burning logs. One by one, their eyes closed. Then came the scream. The drunk awoke thrashing, a steel snare biting deep into his leg. Blood spotted the snow as he clawed at it, teeth bared in pain. The brute and the brothers lunged to free him, but the iron would not give. The trapper's design was merciless, jaws forged with patient hands that knew no pity. The drunk's cries carried into the trees, echoing, twisting the night into terror. The scarred soldier stood apart, rifle in hand, watching the tree-line. His breath came slow. "He's here," he muttered. "He's been here all along." The brute spat. "Let him come. I'll break him in half." But even the brute's voice cracked, the bravado faltering under the weight of unseen eyes. From the ridge, Crow's Shadow moved silently, his shadow cast by nothing but the flames below. Each trap was not random, but part of a web woven long ago. He did not need to rush. The valley itself had become his ally. The outlaws cursed and fought against iron and fear, but every step, every shout only tangled them deeper. The pit waited, the snares clamped, the night itself pressing down. The fire they had lit no longer warmed them. It only painted them as targets, bright against the wilderness that swallowed all else. Their laughter had died. In its place grew whispers, doubts, the first bite of panic. And still above them, unseen, the man they hunted watched with steady eyes. He had returned not to ash or ruin, but to a war he had always known would find him again. The valley held its breath. The night had only just begun. Snow came down in sheets so heavy the world vanished. The valley became a white void, every tree bending under its burden, every sound swallowed before it could travel. Horses screamed in the dark as wind clawed through their manes. The fire the outlaws had once gathered around was drowned beneath drifts, leaving only embers sputtering beneath a skin of ice. They huddled together at first, but desperation gnawed quickly at their nerves. "This storm will bury us alive," one of the brothers hissed, clutching his coat tight. "We can't sit still." The brute shook his head, snow caked in his beard. "Then we move. Spread out, flush him out. He ain't a ghost, he's flesh. We'll smoke him from the timber." The scarred soldier gave no answer. His eyes scanned the tree-line, where shadows slid and shifted in the storm. He had fought in squalls before. He knew when the enemy was closer than the cold. They split, each taking a slice of the valley. Lanterns dimmed, rifles readied. Yet for all their bravado, the wilderness swallowed them like a mouth. The brute went first. He lumbered into the storm, cursing, shouting for Crow's shadow to face him. His laughter rang false, brittle against the howl of wind. He swung his rifle back and forth, firing blind into trees. A branch cracked above him, snow dropping like a curtain, blinding him further. Out of the white came silence, then a single shot. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't panicked. It was deliberate. The brute dropped into the snow, the storm covering him before his body grew cold. Farther off, the knife thrower crept along a ridge, blades glinting faintly in the stormlight. He trusted steel more than lead, moving low and silent. He thought himself the hunter, but each step he took fell into patterns already marked, paths watched by eyes older than his violence. When he paused to peer into the dark, a snare snapped closed on his arm, dragging him off balance. His scream tore through the night, cut short by another sound, the whisper of steel through air, a knife thrown not by him, but by the man he hunted. It found its mark. Silence reclaimed a ridge. The drunk stumbled aimlessly, flask frozen in his grip, breath ragged. He called out for his brothers, for anyone, his voice cracking into sobs. The storm didn't care. Neither did Crow's shadow. The drunk's lantern flickered, casting light over snow that seemed unbroken, until it collapsed beneath him. Another pit, another grave carved by patience. The drunk's cry echoed once, then was lost beneath snow and stone. Only 3 remained now. The brothers pressed close together, fear creeping in where bravado once stood. They argued in harsh whispers, each accusing the other of leading them into death. "This was your idea," one spat, frost rhyming his mustache. "Your greed brought us here." "You followed," the other snapped back. "Always chasing my lead, always wanting my shadow." Snow built on their shoulders, their faces twisted by anger sharper than the cold. It was not Crow's shadow who turned them then. It was their own fear. The bond that made them strong shattered. One drew first, gunpowder sparking, the shot tearing through the storm. His brother fell, the red seeping into snow almost instantly erased by white. The survivor stared at what he'd done, horror breaking over his features. Then came the echo of a second gunshot, this one not his own. He joined his kin in the drifts, 2 brothers claimed together after all. Only the scarred soldier remained. He moved differently now, slower, deliberate. He had fought against men like Crow's shadow before, and the memories clawed at him as he trudged through the storm. When he paused beneath a leaning pine, he whispered to himself, as though speaking to ghosts. "Crow's shadow, the butcher scout, they said you vanished." A figure moved in the storm, half seen, half imagined. The soldier raised his rifle but hesitated, breath shaking. "You should have stayed gone." His words vanished in the wind. A moment later, so did he. One clean shot, no waste, no malice, only precision. The storm thickened, blotting out all but white. Only one outlaw yet lived. The drunk brute of a man who had boasted numbers meant safety, who had laughed at tales of shadows. He staggered upward, dragging himself toward the canyon rim where the storm tore at the cliffs. The land there dropped sheer into blackness, a maw of stone waiting to swallow. Still he went, desperate for high ground, desperate to see the enemy who had destroyed his men. And there, in the swirl of snow, he found him. Crow's shadow stood steady at the rim, tall, coat drawn tight, rifle calm in his hands. No rage marked his face, no joy. Only stillness, the patience of a man shaped by endless winters and wars. The outlaw spat blood into the snow, gripping his gun with trembling hands. "You think one man can beat 6?" His voice cracked into laughter, hollow now. "We were many. You were one. But storms end. And when they do, I'll still be here." The storm howled harder, snow carving across his face, but only one figure remained upright, unshaken. The outlaw blinked, tried to steady his hands, but the wind ripped his aim astray. He fired into nothing, the shot swallowed before it found purchase. Crow's shadow did not flinch. He raised his rifle slow, deliberate, and fired once. The outlaw stumbled back, boots sliding on ice, arms flailing as the canyon claimed him. His scream tore through the storm until stone and shadow silenced it forever. Snow drifted soft again, blanketing the valley. The storm eased, leaving behind only silence. At the rim, Crow's shadow stood alone, rifle cooling in the night. His eyes lifted to the endless sky, but no triumph marked them. Only the stillness of a man who had done what must be done. And when dawn came, the valley held no sign of the men who had ridden against him. Only one figure remained, steady, silent, a shadow in the snow. Dawn came soft, pale light spilling over the mountains like a whispered secret. Snow had fallen through the night, layer upon layer, until the valley lay smooth and white, untouched. The storm had done its work well. No bodies remained visible. No signs of struggle marked the earth. The blood, the footprints, the chaos, all swallowed by the hush of winter. To any who wandered there now, it would look as though nothing had happened at all. But something had. A single figure walked through the valley, boots crunching faint in the crusted snow. He carried no torch, no banner of triumph. His face gave nothing, and his eyes, cold, steady, looked not behind him but forward. Crow's shadow left no mark of victory, no sign of rebuilding. The cabin lay charred and broken, black ribs jutting against the pale blanket of snow. Yet he did not pause to mourn. What was lost was lost. He would not raise walls again. He would not lay roots where roots were meant only to burn. He passed the ruins without slowing, the locket still tucked against his chest, his rifle slung with the patience of a man who would always be ready. Behind him, hidden beneath drifts and silence, his traps remained. Steel jaws, pits, snares, all buried again, waiting in the earth like iron bones. They would not rust. They would not vanish. They would lie in the valley, unseen guardians, silent as crows circling above. Years later, far from that place, the story grew. It was not Crow's shadow who told it. He never walked into towns with his tail, never lifted his voice to claim vengeance or victory. It was the boy, the one dragged from the river, the one who had coughed water into his cabin's firelight. That boy grew, and in the years that followed he carried a memory sharper than any knife. In a saloon thick with smoke and the sound of boots on floorboards, he leaned forward one night, voice low but sure. "They rode against a trapper," he said, eyes glinting in lamplight. But he was the legend they feared all along. The room stilled, cards frozen in hands, whiskey paused on lips. Men leaned closer. Some scoffed, but more listened, for there was a weight in the boy's words, the kind of weight truth always carried when wrapped in myth. The tale spread from there, across campfires, down riverboats, into mining camps and ranch kitchens. Outlaws learned to curse the name in whispers, and children learned to listen for silence in the trees. They said Crow's shadow was still out there watching, that the valley was his graveyard, his kingdom, his warning. None who went searching ever returned to prove otherwise. And tell me, when your trail grows dark and the pines fall silent, would you keep riding or turn back before the shadow finds you? Because some men die and are buried, their names forgotten. But some do not die, not really. They linger, folded into the earth and the silence it keeps. Some legends live not in towns or graves, but in the silence of a wild waiting.